If you listen from a city shaped by history and stone, leave its name in the comments. And if you wish to walk further into Faerun's oldest truths, subscribe and remain with this chronicle. These words come from ages before maps were stable and crowns were temporary. Now we begin. In the dawn ages of Teril, when the world was still settling from divine violence and elemental chaos, the giants were not scattered clans lurking in mountains. They were empire builders. Their civilization, remembered as Astoria, rose in the distant past, long before the rise of Netheril, before the Crown Wars, and before humanity had learned to shape magic into nations. Astoria was not a single city, but a continental dominion, stretching across what would one day become the savage frontier, the Great Glacier, and lands now lost beneath ice and sea. The giants believed their rule was not merely earned, but ordained. Their gods had given them a cosmic structure known as the Ordning, a rigid hierarchy that defined the place of every giant by type and status. Storm giants stood closest to the divine, entrusted with prophecy and judgment. Below them came cloud giants, masters of skyborne citadels and illusion. Fire giants, smith kings of volcanic forges. Frost giants, conquerors of the frozen north. Stone giants, keepers of deep memory. And hill giants, the lowest, valued for labor and war. This order was not debated. It was accepted as natural law. At first, this system created unity. Each caste knew its role, its duties, and its limits. Giant cities rose with impossible scale, arches wide enough for dragons to fly through, stairways carved for strides measured in yards rather than steps. Their runic magic was slow but monumental, bound into stone, metal, and bloodlines. These were not spells cast in moments, but workings meant to last centuries. Fortresses did not merely defend, they reshaped the land around them. Yet even at the height of Astoria's power, the seeds of its fall were already present. The Ordning rewarded obedience over innovation. Authority flowed downward, but insight rarely flowed up. Storm giants interpreted omens and issued decrees, but the structure allowed little room for dissent, even when circumstances changed. Strength was revered, but adaptability was not. As Astoria expanded, it inevitably encountered another ancient power, the dragons. These were not the isolated worms of later ages, but vast flights of intelligent, territorial beings who remembered the same primordial world the giants claimed as theirs. Dragons did not acknowledge the Ordning. They recognized no hierarchy but their own age, might, and cunning. Where giants built to endure, dragons claimed through presence and destruction. The first clashes were not yet total war. Skirmishes over mountain ranges, raids on hordes, the destruction of outlying strongholds. But every confrontation escalated. Each victory demanded retribution. Each loss demanded vengeance. Over time, the conflict hardened into what later lore would remember as the Dragon-Giant War, though in truth it was not one war, but an age defined by repeated cataclysms. Entire regions were reshaped. Glaciers advanced where fire met frost. Mountain chains collapsed under sustained magical assault. The giants, accustomed to fighting creatures smaller than themselves, found dragons to be adversaries of equal will and greater mobility. A single worm could devastate a city's heart before legions could respond. A flight could erase centuries of labor in a night. Still, Astoria did not fall quickly. Its size sustained it. Its traditions held it together. But reliance on centralized authority became a vulnerability. When storm giant kings were slain or vanished, confusion spread through the hierarchy. Command stalled. Rival castes blamed one another. Decisions were delayed, while omens were interpreted and rituals observed, even as cities burned. In this era, a crucial shift occurred. Giants began to fight defensively rather than expansively. Strongholds withdrew into mountains and remote regions. Resources once used to build were redirected to preserve what remained. This retreat was not acknowledged as defeat, but it marked the moment when Astoria ceased to grow. By the end of this age, the giant empires still existed in name, but not in spirit. Their power was fractured, their unity strained, their confidence shaken by an enemy that could not be ordered, subdued, or absorbed into tradition. The giants still believed their fall was impossible. History would prove otherwise. The collapse of giant power did not arrive as a single moment of ruin. It unfolded unevenly, city by city, caste by caste, as the assumptions that once sustained Astoria began to fail under pressure. What had long been considered unbreakable, the ordning itself, became a constraint that magnified every loss. As the dragon-giant conflict dragged on, storm giants attempted to preserve unity through prophecy and decree. Omens were read, celestial signs interpreted, and judgments issued from distant courts. Yet these visions increasingly reflected a world that no longer existed. Dragons did not fight according to cycles or seasons that prophecy favored. They struck opportunistically, choosing targets of symbolic value rather than strategic necessity. Temples fell. Rune halls were shattered. Places believed to be divinely protected proved vulnerable. Cloud giants responded differently. Their floating citadels, once symbols of superiority, became instruments of retreat. Entire courts withdrew into the skies, severing ties with surface holdings and abandoning alliances that had bound the empire together. What had once been a shared civilization fractured into self-preserving enclaves. Each withdrawal weakened the whole. Fire giants attempted to impose order through force. Their forges continued to burn, producing weapons of extraordinary size and endurance. Yet even their mastery of craft could not overcome the fundamental imbalance of the war. Dragons chose when and where to engage. Fire giants could win battles, but they could not secure peace. Every forge became a target. Every victory invited retaliation. Frost giants, long accustomed to raiding and conquest, fared no better. Their domains lay closest to regions where draconic flights were strongest. Many frost giant holds were erased entirely, not conquered, but annihilated. Survivors scattered into tundra and sea, preserving their culture through saga rather than structure. Stone giants endured longer, not through strength, but through withdrawal. Retreating into deep caverns and isolated valleys, they preserved ancient memories of Astoria even as the empire ceased to function. They recorded what others could not. The slow realization that the world had changed beyond the giant's ability to command it. Throughout this decline, a fatal belief persisted. Giants did not imagine a future without dominance. They assumed the war would end, as all things had before, with the restoration of order. This assumption shaped every decision. Instead of reforming their hierarchy, they reinforced it. Instead of decentralizing authority, they clung to ritual. Adaptation was seen not as survival, but as heresy against divine design. Meanwhile, the dragons adapted constantly. Alliances shifted. Territories changed hands. Younger worms learned from older ones, refining tactics that giants never anticipated. The conflict was no longer merely physical, it was ideological. One side believed history had a fixed shape. The other believed history belonged to whoever could seize it. By the time the giants recognized the depth of their crisis, their empire was already hollow. Roads went unrepaired. Rune networks failed. Cities stood intact but underpopulated, their rulers issuing commands to subjects who were no longer there. The power of Astoria still cast a shadow, but its substance was fading. The giants had not yet fallen completely, but the age of unquestioned rule was over, and in its place emerged a truth the Ordning had never prepared them to face. Survival would require change, not reverence. The true end of the giant empires began not with conquest, but with loss of continuity. Astoria had endured wars before, disasters before, even divine displeasure. What it had never endured was a prolonged age in which knowledge, authority, and territory failed to pass intact from one generation to the next. Storm giants, whose role was to preserve cosmic balance, suffered the most damaging losses. Their courts were not merely political centers, but repositories of prophecy and historical memory. When several of these courts were destroyed or abandoned during the later stages of the dragon-giant conflicts, vast portions of giant history vanished with them. Decisions once grounded in precedent became guesswork. Judgment grew cautious, then hesitant. Silence replaced command. This erosion of leadership created a subtle but devastating effect. Without clear authority from the highest caste, the Ordning no longer functioned as a living system. It remained law, but not guidance. Giants still knew their rank, but increasingly did not know their purpose. Obedience without direction bred paralysis. Into this vacuum stepped the consequences of divine distance. The giant gods, Animal Father foremost among them, had shaped the Ordning as a reflection of cosmic order. But divine favor was never unconditional. As the giants failed to uphold balance and stewardship of the world, the gods did not intervene to preserve empire. No celestial host descended to restore Astoria. No miracle reversed its decline. The absence was not punishment, but abandonment. This withdrawal was not obvious to the giants at first. Rituals continued. Prayers were spoken. Yet responses faded. Omens grew rare or ambiguous. The storm giants, once interpreters of divine will, found themselves interpreting echoes. The certainty that had sustained empire for millennia slowly dissolved. At the same time, the physical landscape of Faerun no longer favored giant dominion. Regions once stabilized by giant engineering and magic fell into ruin. Roads collapsed. Weather patterns shifted. Ancient runes that regulated stone, ice, and flame weakened as their creators died or retreated. What had been a carefully maintained world became hostile even to its former masters. Into these spaces moved younger races. Dwarves settled abandoned mountain halls, mistaking ruins for opportunity. Elves reclaimed forests long cleared by giant hands. Even early human cultures began to inhabit valleys once dominated by colossal fortresses, unaware of the full weight of history beneath their feet. The giants observed this encroachment with confusion rather than rage. The Ordning had never accounted for replacement. It assumed permanence. Giants did not understand decline as a process, only defeat. And so they did not act decisively against these smaller peoples, believing their presence temporary, insignificant. This misjudgment proved irreversible. By the time giants recognized that the world was reorganizing without them, their capacity to respond had eroded beyond recovery. What remained of Astoria was no longer an empire, but a memory preserved unevenly across castes, regions, and generations. The fall was no longer approaching. It was already underway. The disappearance of the giant empires did not conclude with a final battle or a single defining catastrophe. It concluded with irrelevance. Once the world no longer reacted to giant power, their dominion ended in practice, even if fragments survived in stone and blood. As centuries passed, the remnants of Astoria fragmented into isolated strongholds, each bound to a single caste and a single environment. Storm giants withdrew to remote seas and unreachable courts, no longer ruling, only observing. Cloud giants drifted above the world, detached from its politics, preserving the appearance of nobility while surrendering influence. Fire giants entrenched themselves in volcanic fastnesses, where purpose narrowed to craft and conquest without vision. This fragmentation had a profound consequence. Without an empire, the ordning transformed from a unifying structure into a barrier. Cooperation between castes diminished. Mutual obligation faded. Each group interpreted divine law to justify its own survival, rather than collective responsibility. What had once bound giants together now kept them apart. The younger races adapted faster than the giants ever could. Dwarves learned to reclaim and repurpose colossal ruins, turning giant halls into fortresses of their own. Elves wove settlements into lands giants had reshaped but abandoned. Humans, more flexible and numerous, spread rapidly, filling the gaps left by collapsing ancient powers. None of these peoples challenged the giants directly. They simply endured longer. This quiet replacement unsettled the giants more than war ever had. Dragons had been enemies worthy of legend. The younger races were not. They did not demand tribute. They did not seek conquest of giant realms. They ignored them. Power that inspires neither fear nor resistance is already gone. Attempts to reclaim authority came too late and without unity. Isolated wars flared and died without consequence. A giant king might crush a city, only to find its loss reshaped nothing beyond a single valley. No empire responded. No age shifted. The world absorbed the violence and moved on. At the center of this failure lay belief. Giants had trusted that size, age, and divine origin guaranteed relevance. They had mistaken endurance for permanence. When history required adaptation rather than strength, their traditions offered no answer. By the time giants fully understood their place in the new world, it had already been decided for them. They would endure as peoples, not rulers, as memories, not architects, as echoes of an age when the world had been younger and less crowded. The fall of the giant empires was complete, not because their bodies were broken, but because their purpose was no longer needed. The final unraveling of giant dominion occurred when history itself ceased to be written in their scale. From that point forward, events no longer revolved around giant decisions, giant wars, or giant ambition. The world's great shifts began elsewhere, driven by forces the giants neither commanded nor fully understood. The rise of draconic dominance after the dragon-giant conflicts reshaped the balance of power permanently. Dragons did not inherit empire in the way giants had held it. Instead, they imposed influence through fear, territory, and presence. Where giants had ruled by structure, dragons ruled by pressure. This difference mattered. A world fragmented by fear adapts quickly. A world bound by hierarchy does not. As dragons claimed skies, mountains, and ancient hordes, giants were forced into reactive roles. They defended ancestral sites rather than shaping the future. Their conflicts became local, not continental. A storm giant court might still command awe, but its judgments no longer altered the fate of nations. Authority without consequence became ritual. During this same era, Divine history moved forward without the giants at its center. The rise of younger gods, the growing influence of elven and human deities, and the slow rearrangement of divine portfolios reflected a multiverse no longer anchored to primordial races. The giant gods endured, but they no longer defined epochs. Their myths became static while others evolved. This shift affected giant culture profoundly. Traditions once tied to cosmic relevance became ceremonial. Songs that had commemorated empire turned into laments. Stone giants preserved memory, not to guide the future, but to prevent total forgetting. Even the ordning, still believed sacred, increasingly described a world that no longer existed. There were moments when giants could have changed course. Lore records rare attempts at reform, isolated leaders who questioned whether hierarchy itself had become a weakness. But these efforts never spread. The weight of tradition crushed innovation before it could take root. Unity had once been the giants' greatest strength. It became their greatest restraint. By the late ages before recorded human history, giants were no longer a civilizational force. They were a mythic presence, feared, respected, occasionally encountered, but no longer central. Their ruins dwarfed new cities, yet those cities endured longer. Their bones lay beneath roads built by smaller hands. The world had not destroyed the giants. It had simply learned how to continue without them. And that realization marked the true end of the giant empires. What followed was not extinction, but distortion. The giants survived into later ages, yet no longer as heirs of a unified past. Their civilizations became fragmented reflections of what Astoria had once been, recognizable in form, but hollowed of intent. Without empire, each giant caste reinterpreted the ordning in isolation. Storm giants clung to their role as observers of fate, convincing themselves that withdrawal was wisdom rather than retreat. Their courts became distant and inscrutable, preserving prophecy without acting upon it. Knowledge remained vast, but influence faded into silence. Cloud giants embraced illusion and spectacle, transforming authority into pageantry. Floating castles still drifted across the skies, but they ruled nothing beneath them. Their power became performative, measured in appearances rather than consequence. Grandeur replaced governance. Fire giants hardened. Deprived of a world to organize, they narrowed their purpose to conquest and industry. Their forges still produced wonders, but without an empire to support. Creation served only endless preparation for wars that never reshaped history. Strength became repetition. Frost giants, once raiders of vast territories, were reduced to cycles of survival and violence. Their sagas preserved memory, but memory without future became burden. Each generation inherited glory it could no longer recreate. Stone giants endured differently. They retreated from surface history almost entirely, preserving the memory of Astoria as a sacred truth rather than a political goal. Of all castes, they understood the fall most clearly. They did not deny it. They remembered it. Across all these remnants, one pattern persisted. The ordning still existed, but no longer served its original purpose. It had been designed for empire, not survival. In a world of smaller, faster civilizations, rigid hierarchy offered no advantage. Giants obeyed law long after law ceased to protect them. This created a quiet tragedy. Giants did not fail because they were weak, nor because their gods abandoned them outright. They failed because their greatest achievement, the structure that once unified them, could not evolve. What had brought order to a chaotic world could not respond when the world changed again. By this stage of history, Giants were no longer builders of ages. They were custodians of ruins, guardians of memories too large for the present to carry. Their presence remained awe-inspiring, but awe alone does not shape history. The empires of the giants had not merely fallen. They had become anachronisms, perfectly preserved answers to questions the world no longer asked. The final consequence of the giants' fall was not measured in lost territory, but in lost relevance within the cosmic order of Faerun. Once, the giants had stood alongside dragons and primordials as shapers of epochs. Now, they existed within a world governed by faster cycles, younger ambitions, and more adaptable powers. As history moved forward, magic itself changed. Arcane traditions once shaped around monumental runes and slow, enduring workings gave way to more flexible spellcraft. Elves refined high magic. Humans experimented, failed, and adapted rapidly. Giants, whose magic was bound to place, lineage, and time, found themselves outpaced. Their spells endured, but could not respond. Permanence became a liability. This shift altered how giants were perceived. Where they had once been rulers, they became obstacles or curiosities, forces to be avoided, bargained with, or occasionally overcome. Their presence inspired fear, but rarely allegiance. Even dragons, once their great rivals, adjusted to this new reality more effectively, leveraging mobility and cunning rather than structure. In the records of later ages, giants appear sporadically. A ruined fortress reclaimed, a tyrant defeated, a wandering colossus encountered at the edge of civilization. These moments feel isolated because they are. Giants no longer act as a unified force. Each appearance is an echo, disconnected from any greater purpose. The divine order reflected this change. The giant gods remained, but their worship dwindled outside giant kind. Their myths stabilized, repeating the same eternal truths without evolving interpretation. Meanwhile, other pantheons expanded, fractured, and redefined themselves in response to mortal belief. Relevance, once again, belonged to those who could change. Yet the fall of the giant empires was not meaningless. Their legacy shaped everything that followed. Roads built by giants guided later trade routes, mountains reshaped by their hands, determined borders for younger nations. Ruins became foundations. Even in absence, the giants influenced the world's shape. This is the quiet irony of their history. The giants did not vanish. They became infrastructure. Their achievements absorbed into a world that no longer remembered who built it. And in that absorption lies the final lesson of their fall. Power that cannot adapt does not disappear. It is repurposed, diminished, and finally forgotten as authority, even while its shadows continue to support the future of others. What history records next is not a resurgence, but a redefinition of what giants were allowed to be. As the ages advanced and the great narratives of Faerun focused on empires of elves, the rise and fall of human realms, and the ambitions of archmages and gods, giants were steadily pushed to the margins of written memory. Chroniclers did not erase them. They simply stopped centering them. Giants became background forces, hazards on the map, legends attached to ruins, figures encountered rather than followed. This change altered how giants understood themselves. Without empire, without divine mandate that shaped the world directly, identity fractured. Many giants clung to ancestral myths, repeating them as proof that the present was temporary and decline an illusion. Others quietly accepted that the age of command had passed, even if the ordning forbade them from saying so openly. The ordning itself persisted, but its meaning inverted. Where it once directed the expansion and maintenance of civilization, it now justified stagnation. A storm giant still ruled a court, but ruled over withdrawal. A fire giant still commanded forges, but forged for no greater vision. Rank endured, purpose did not. This rigidity had consequences beyond giant society. Younger races learned from it. Dwarves observed the danger of inflexible hierarchy and built cultures that valued craft over lineage. Elves preserved tradition, but allowed adaptation through cycles of renewal. Humans, most of all, absorbed the lesson quickly. Power must change or it will be replaced. Giants, bound to cosmic order rather than historical momentum, could not adopt this approach without rejecting the very foundation of their belief. To abandon the ordning would have meant admitting that divine design itself could fail. That admission never came. And so giants remained exactly what the world expected them to be: immense, ancient, and increasingly irrelevant. Their fall was now complete not only in practice, but in perception. To the world at large, giants were no longer former rulers awaiting return. They were relics, dangerous, awe-inspiring relics, but relics nonetheless. History had passed judgment without ceremony. The age of giants had not ended in fire or flood. It ended when no one waited for them to matter again. By the time mortal history reached its familiar milestones, the giant empires survived only in fragments of understanding. What remained of Astoria was no longer a political reality, but an archaeological one. Its truth scattered across ruins too vast to be misinterpreted, yet too old to be fully understood. Across the north, broken citadels lay half-buried in ice and stone, their scale dwarfing the settlements that later rose around them. These structures were not mysterious in purpose. Their function was clear. What was lost was the mindset that created them. Younger races could inhabit giant halls, repurpose giant roads, even wield giant forged weapons, but they could not recreate the worldview that made such works inevitable rather than exceptional. Lore keepers among dwarves and elves preserved partial records of the giants' fall, though often stripped of context. Giants appeared in these accounts as adversaries, tyrants, or vanished masters, not as builders of order. The long view was lost. History compressed millennia of gradual collapse into legends of sudden ruin, reinforcing the illusion that the giants had fallen through violence alone. Giants themselves remembered differently. Oral traditions preserved continuity where written records failed. Storm giants spoke of ages as tides rather than chapters. Stone giants remembered landscapes before names. Frost giant sagas preserved the humiliation of retreat more vividly than defeat. These memories were accurate but inward-facing. They did not shape the world beyond giant kind. This inward turn marked the final transformation. Once, giants had interpreted the world for others. Their architecture imposed meaning. Their hierarchy enforced stability. Now their understanding of history existed almost entirely within themselves. Knowledge unshared becomes inert. Wisdom unexpressed does not govern. There were moments when the past nearly resurfaced. Scholars uncovered runic sites. Adventurers unearthed relics that hinted at a time when giants shaped continents deliberately. For a brief moment, the scale of what had been lost became visible. But these discoveries inspired awe, not revival. The world did not attempt to restore what it could not inhabit. By this stage, the fate of the giant empires was sealed not by enemies or gods, but by historical momentum. The world had chosen smaller hands, faster minds, and flexible power. Giants could not become that without ceasing to be themselves, and so their legacy settled into its final form, not as rulers, not as villains, but as silent witnesses to a truth few civilizations learn in time. Greatness is not preserved by memory alone. The story of the giant empires ends not with silence, but with context. Astoria did not fail because it lacked strength, faith, or antiquity. It failed because it was built to impose order on a world that no longer required it. When Faerun was young and unstable, the giant's rigidity created structure. When the world matured, crowded with gods, peoples, and competing visions, that same rigidity became obstruction. The ordning, once a cosmic solution, became a historical error. It assumed that divine design was static, that authority flowed only downward, and that permanence was proof of correctness. But Faerun proved otherwise. Power shifted to those who could negotiate change rather than deny it. Giants, bound to a sacred hierarchy they could neither revise nor abandon, were left behind by history they had helped shape. Their fall was therefore not a judgment against their greatness, but against its limits. Giants remained mighty as individuals. Their magic endured. Their gods persisted. Yet civilization is not sustained by endurance alone. It requires renewal, reinterpretation, and willingness to relinquish forms that no longer serve purpose. In the ages that followed, the world stood upon the giants' work without inheriting their rule. Mountains they carved defined borders. Roads they laid guided commerce. Ruins they abandoned became foundations for younger realms. The giants did not vanish. They were absorbed. And this is the final truth their history reveals. Empires do not end when they are destroyed. They end when the world no longer needs them. That was how the giant empires fell,